Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
K/X/storytime, and maybe this will get me some help. So, some backstory. I grew up on a farm, so most of my interactions with friends were cut down to a minimum when I was younger. My parents were always working, so I couldn't go to things, so I didn't really have many friends outside of those I could make in school hours. Danner sticks out the most in my memory. She was this weird little girl, kind of distant and vaguely hostile to basically everyone around her. I noticed she had interests similar to mine: comics, video games, horror stuff, which was unusual for a girl, which got me hooked. And once she figured out I was genuinely interested in her, she quickly became one of the best friends I would have in school. Danner was a few grades higher than me, so we rarely got to see each other except in lunch and study halls. But when we did hang out, she would always be in the old academy part of the building. We would just be chilling, reading a stack of her old comics or playing on our Game Boys, and something would happen. It always did with Danner. The time that I think I realized something bad was going on was the end of the school year one year, and we were hanging out in the balcony of the old gym. She had had an upsetting day. I could tell because even though she was her typical no-bullshit Danner, her face was all blotchy and red from crying. So I didn't ask questions. I just sat down when I found her and picked up the pile of comics she'd put down for me. I had just been about to say something when what was definitely a basketball hit the opposite wall from us. I didn't immediately register that this wasn't a good thing. I had been sitting with my legs dangling down from the balcony, something Danner always told me not to do, so it was easy to see the basketball rolling at a quick clip, as if it had been thrown. Danner, who had been lying on her stomach, had propped herself up further and squinted down into the dark court. By the way, obviously not Danner, but reminds me of her. Danner hates her picture being taken and is a little more unkempt than this girl. "Fuck, it's going to be an asshole today," was all she said before she scooted her knees up under her and started amassing the comics together in a pile. Let's go. I honestly didn't know what the big deal was. It was probably just some douche messing with us, and I said so. But Danner just gave me an "are you fucking stupid" look and then shrugged. "You want to see it? Go on ahead. Don't say I didn't warn you." I didn't know what to think about that. Mostly I was in the middle of being all manly and shit, and trying to impress Danner by showing her I wasn't scared of some bullshit basketball. So we sat there quietly, Danner, me, and my raging testosterone, and after about 5 minutes there was the sound of a latch being hit, and I looked over to where the sound obviously came from, the equipment room. Even from where I was sitting, I could see the handle of the big double metal doors was depressed, and no one was there. The door gave a little jolt, like something was pushing it from the inside, but was unable to move completely because a chain with a padlock had been laced through the handles. In the crack that it opened, you could clearly see the inside of the equipment room, which should have been impossible. The power had been cut to the academy building, so it would have been impossible to turn on the lights even if we wanted to. But the fluorescents were running fine as ever. After a few seconds, the door eased back shut, possibly as though it were a draft, and then jolted strongly again, as though someone had pulled it from the inside. Danner had obviously seen enough, because she grabbed my shirt and pulled me upright, and through the tiny little stairwell that led to the hallway outside the gym. I remember that tiny 12-step stairway being the worst, longest journey of my life. I kept expecting the door behind us to open, and something to come tumbling down after us, or the door below us to open and something with red eyes and long needle teeth with a slavering mouth to come charging up at us. Luckily, neither happened, though upon opening the door, Danner did look both ways into the hallway, before marching us to the exit door propped open with a Mountain Dew bottle. Once out, she kept walking us, a fistful of my shirt, to the little park that conjoined the new central school we went to, and the academy. I remember asking her a lot of questions, to which most of the answers were, "Shut up." And then, the question that finally brought her out of her shell, "How long have you been seeing this sort of stuff?" She gave me a withering glare. "All my life, jackass," she had said. This sort of thing has been happening in the academy for years, even before we were born. And then she sort of started crying again, and I awkwardly hugged her. I wasn't sure how to make any of this better, but maybe hugging would help. After a few minutes, she pushed away, wiped her face, and marched back to the academy without me. She collected her dew bottle and was silent as she walked back to me. The conversation was pretty much over, I could tell, but I felt like I had been let into this wonderful little Danner club with its own special password and handshake and everything. And that was how Danner and I started on these stupid, crazy adventures together. Mostly it was my idea, since Danner experienced these all the time. But I had gotten the taste of something that scared the shit out of me, and also let me be in the presence of this girl, and fucked if I was going to let this opportunity pass. So I made her promise to show me all the places like that in the academy, and then the town, etc., etc. As time went on, Danner would eventually graduate and go to college before me. I got a girlfriend, who was basically the opposite of Danner. Although pretty, she was slightly vain and materialistic and rather self-centered. But she was also psychologically broken, a trait I am unfortunately attracted to, something that originally attracted me to Danner, and we lost touch. However, I would realize soon we were going to college a few miles apart from each other, but I'll get to that eventually. For now, I'll tell you more about my high school shenanigans. Danner was mostly universally loved by the teachers. She was obviously smart and more well-read than most of us, so it was no trouble for her to sneak us out of the class and go play. She would wait outside and then we would quietly go together, walking purposefully to the academy, as if any student had a reason to be in the academy. Shortly after our first stint in the gymnasium, still about a week before school let out, Danner laid out the ground rules. The gym, classrooms, and lunchroom were all fair game, and she would show them to me. The second-floor maintenance room, the basement, and auditorium were all off-limits. Under no circumstances were we to go inside, and we were to avoid them at all costs, even if the building is on fire. This ultimatum and her expression had me scared. We were standing outside the service door, the lock of which had broken long ago, so Danner was always able to sneak in after propping it open. The weather was definitely warm, being late May, but I remember getting goosebumps and I had asked why. Danner had just looked at me for a really long time, chewing on the inside of her mouth, and then had made me promise not to tell anyone else what she was about to tell me, and until now, I've never told another soul. But anyway, here's the story, according to her. Apparently, back in the day, meaning the 70s, there had been some sort of accident in the school. There was some sort of gas leak or something during a school assembly. Most of the lower grades in the school had been in the auditorium at the time, and most of them had smothered inside the auditorium. What no one understood was why the doors had been locked. Nearly 20 children had died. Sounds small, but it was a rural area, and that still would have been grades 1 to 6, and no one knew why, or why none of the adults had. It was one of those tragic town mysteries that was never explained. The basement had been subject to a fire, started by the unstable groundskeeper, who had also perished in the fire. Along with his body, however, they also found a number of others, all smaller and evidently children. However, this being the late 30s, the best they could do to try to identify the bodies had been dental records, none of which had matched anyone they could find. No one local had gone missing lately. Another strange and tragic mystery. The maintenance room was just off limits. Danner refused to explain why. Also, the nurse's room, which she also refused to explain why, but muttered something about the old-timey medical equipment freaked her out. Thinking about it today, there really shouldn't have been anything earlier than 80s medical equipment, which really kind of resembles our own. A few of these taboos I broke, which I'll tell you about soon enough. But for now, I'll tell you about our exploits around the rest of the school. Sneaking in through the same service door means we always had to pass the gym, and then the auditorium. Danner hated doing this, so we always scooted past rather quickly. The good thing about the academy was it had huge windows basically everywhere, so navigating through it even with the power off was simple. Danner led me to the 5th grade classroom the first day and plopped down in one of the ancient desks. I was kind of stunned. The desks were sitting as neatly as the day they had been left there. There was graffiti scratched on some, the typical stuff, initials, random sayings, and some stranger stuff. The desk adjacent to the one Danner had sat down in and promptly began reading had been written on in black Sharpie with the same sentence over and over. "Don't look at me." The surface of the desk was black with it. I sat down at the desk in front of Danner. The silence and stillness was already getting to me. It felt like the teacher and kids would be back from lunch or gym or assembly any second, but the minutes just ticked silently on. "Look at the door," Danner muttered. Even though it had been completely silent, I almost missed it. She was hunched down in her seat, sitting on her tailbone, nose in her book. I glanced over to the door, which Danner had closed behind us, and my attention was drawn immediately to the small vertical window set in the side of the door. Someone was staring directly back at me, their eyes so wide I could see the whites around the entire iris. Cue me leaping from the desk away from the door. I think I may have shouted or whimpered or something. I was just glad I didn't pee myself. When I looked back to the door, the staring eyes were no longer there. Danner had also stood up and was opening the window behind us. She had wanted to call it quits that day, and also didn't want to leave through the hallway. That was okay, since I didn't either. The longer I thought about it, the more I realized I should have been able to see more of the face, or have heard someone approaching. When I told this to Danner, who was climbing out the window, she just scrunched up her face. No, I didn't really want to see the rest of the face. And yeah, I should have been able to hear the person. And that was when I got stupid. I already felt like a fool for having been such a little wuss when Danner had hardly reacted. I wanted to impress her. Danner caught wind of what I was thinking an instant before I put it into action. "Anon, no." And she had reached out to grab some part of me before I whipped around and headed back to the door and opened it. The hallway was empty. I looked to the right, and then, when I had looked to the classrooms to my far left, I just barely caught sight of a shadowy figure peering out of Class 6-1. After a few minutes of a staring contest with the figure, it slipped back into the classroom and the door shut. The hallway and classrooms themselves were reasonably bright. If there had been any distinguishing features about this person, I would have been able to see them. As it was, it had just been an amorphous, person-shaped shadow. I was as manly as I possibly could have been. I turned and went back to Danner, who was standing chest level with the window, looking like she was about to spring back in. Her eyes were wide and I could hear her breathing. She had obviously been scared. I walked back over to her as casually as possible and stepped out of the window as well. As soon as I was out, she began hitting me with her book. "You moron. Never ever separate from me. Ever." The book was a paperback, and so the blows didn't hurt that much. I promised meekly I wouldn't, but I'm a guy, and I was a 14-year-old guy then, so I thought, and sometimes still do, with my second head. As we were walking back to the main school, it occurred to me she couldn't have seen what I had seen and shouldn't have known why I was scared, so I asked her why she had been so afraid. She looked at me very seriously, and then looking at the ground muttered, "Remember what you saw in the door? Once you opened it, the whole time it was there. It was grinning at me. I was so scared I couldn't move." She got a little emotional at this point, which was rare for her, since the only emotion she seemed to feel was stoic. I thought for sure something bad was going to happen. I hadn't seen anything in front of me, so I can only take her word for it. There was a lot of stuff I missed that I knew Danner saw. There were a lot of times where she'd ask, "Did you see that?" Or "Did you hear that?" with a terrified face, only to be met with my blank stare. Most of the time, when I asked her what it had been, she would get her shit together and stonily reply it had been nothing. Occasionally, though, she would be freaked out badly enough to tell me, and invariably I wouldn't want to know what she had seen. I'm glad I seemed to be able to describe something that happened to me as legitimately scary. Thinking back on it, I could describe it like this. I was so scared and worked up. I thought I saw someone looking at me in the window. I don't know if they were really there, but it felt like they were. And once my friend got bored of my shit and left, I went back to see if I was just imagining things and saw a weird shadow. End of story. But anyway, back to Danner and our adventures. So after our first foray into the elementary classrooms, we went to the lunchroom. Honestly, out of all the rooms we visited, I think the classroom was the worst, but I feel the others are worth noting. The thing about the cafeteria is that you get the very strong feeling you're being watched, and you definitely don't want to find the thing that's watching you. So when I met Danner at the cafeteria, I was already uncomfortable. I hadn't seen her the whole day, and it was just a few more days until the end of the semester. She had slipped a note into the slots at the top of my locker, on which she had scrawled to meet her in the academy at lunch, and bring snacks. So I brought chips and soda, cause this was still back in the early 2000s when you could buy this shit in school, and found her sitting on the steps outside. She didn't say anything, but smiled when she saw me, took my hand and led me inside. Once inside, I didn't want to let go for entirely different reasons. The doors to the lunchroom were closed, but Danner had managed to find the keys in the school utility room. She has always had a knack for getting into places she doesn't belong. The serving area was dark, no windows, and the only light was from the cafeteria beyond. Danner let go of my hand and went ahead of me, kind of holding her arms, and I wanted to call her to come back. It felt like there was someone inside, waiting for us. She turned and looked behind her once she found I wasn't following her. I stepped in and joined her quickly, convinced this was the part in horror movies where the unsuspecting teenagers get suddenly assaulted. It sounded suddenly like there were footsteps rushing towards us in the dark as I thought this. Screw this. I barreled into the room beyond, pulling Danner with me and spinning around to look. Nothing there. Danner was laughing quietly at me. I know the dark is scary, but honestly all you heard were the echoes of your own footsteps. Feeling kind of sheepish but still wary, I followed her to the windows on the far side of the cafeteria, where you would discard your tray. She plopped down onto a chair in the only table set out in the entire room. I figured the tables had been transferred to the new school, and wondered where Danner had gotten this one. If she knew what I was thinking, she didn't care. She sat, quietly reading as she usually did. Aside for the dread I had experienced in the service area, nothing else seemed particularly wrong. I really had no idea what this was about, other than a nice little picnic spot. I was about to ask her when she pointed her finger upward, apparently at the ceiling. Not really sure I wanted to see, I looked up. A wall clock sat above us, a noticeably older but similar model to the ones we had in our present classrooms. The second hand, the kind that ticks instead of glides, was stuck passing 12, and the clock itself was frozen at 7:30. Same assembly in the auditorium was when the accident happened, Danner suddenly said. Definitely a significant nope there, but I pointed out it was possible it could have frozen at any time. Creepy coincidence it may have been. We chilled out longer, and Danner decided to head back a little before lunch ended. We didn't go back through the service area, which I was thankful for. I was certain I could hear someone moving around in there, and I was never more glad to see the academy behind me than that day. Aside from this, I guess the only really creepy thing that happened in the school was the auditorium, which was one of the only places Danner forbade me to go. But I honestly ended up there by accident, and once I was there I was curious. You see, the auditorium is connected to a little backlighting room by some back rooms and catwalks. The end of the school year was finally upon us, and we were on our first day of Regents exams. Danner and I had both completed our tests early. Mine had been math, hers French. Once out, Danner had laughed raucously, probably being purposefully disruptive since she hated her French teacher with a passion, and said overly loudly, "Parlez-vous français, putain?" Everyone had to take French to a certain grade, where you could then switch to German if you wanted to. I did it with prejudice. To wind down from the test, and while we waited for our rides home, Danner suggested we go to the academy, and then maybe to the little Amish store across from it. Eager to hang out with Danner for a reason other than the academy, I eagerly complied. Danner said all she really wanted to do was shut up the cafeteria so no one else would know we had been there, and if I didn't want to see anything else, we would be on our way. I agreed, since it was a really nice day and lurking around and being scared shitless wasn't how to spend it. As Danner started the arduous process of chaining everything up, I caught sight of a door set off the side of the cafeteria, maybe 20 feet or so down. It was just ever so slightly open, and there was light coming out. For whatever reason, this didn't fill me with dread. Instead, I was mildly curious. I thought maybe someone else was here with us, possibly the English teacher gathering equipment for the upcoming after-school drama classes. So I didn't call out to Danner, and instead walked down the hall to check. It indeed looked like someone had just been there. There was a teacher's notebook lying on the light switchboard, and the ceiling fluorescent was blazing, like it had been on for a while. A variety of props was leaning against it, and what looked like a Greek toga costume was strewn across the top. And even more curious was the door that was open opposite me. It looked like it led to some steel grating stairs leading up. I still wasn't afraid, though I definitely should have been at this point, but I still hadn't caught on. I was in trouble. I just went in and followed the stairs up. By the time I was halfway up and stepped into a sudden oppressive wall of heat, I realized where I was. I was in the catwalks above the auditorium. I felt my heart immediately start pounding against my ribcage, and my knees went weak. There was a strong stench of some sort of floral perfume imbued into old fabric. The scent was so strong it nearly made me gag. When I looked out to my left, I realized how flimsy and thin my perch was. The stage was far enough beneath me that I was reasonably certain I would break something if I fell, and possibly even die. Something small and white streaked just past my nose. I turned my head in the direction I saw the thing, and saw a small piece of paper drift down onto the catwalk. It was no bigger than a piece of confetti, and it was wadded into a ball. Even as I registered this, I felt a small tap on the back of my head, and something caught in the neck of my t-shirt. Reaching back, I found another small ball of paper, like the first. By now, I was getting the sensation that this wasn't normal. There was nowhere these little scraps of paper could be coming from except above me, and no way of getting there except for being thrown. I felt the hairs on my cheeks and neck stand on end and immediately turned to leave. As I did, I could see the great vast darkness of the seating below me. I can't swear to this, but I almost thought I saw little crosses painted in white on the seats. Honestly, it could have been just about anything, though. I could have been hallucinating from the extreme heat up there. It was the end of May in an air-conditioner-less building, and heat rises. I don't like thinking about the little white crosses. There was probably about a dozen what looked like white crosses painted on the seats. I shouldn't have even been able to see them, except they were so white they were nearly glowing. I got to the bottom of the stairs so fast I tripped. It was dark and the teacher's notebook was gone. I left, closed the door, and never mentioned it to Danner until years later. She never knew. She came out and saw my pale and sweaty countenance and just figured I had been in there too long. We left the academy, and though she wanted to sit on the steps and have me rest for a while, I insisted we go to the little food store. I wanted to be as far away from that building as possible. I never went back inside, and haven't since, even though I live in the area again. I sometimes wonder if those little white crosses are there. As we drank our delicious Amish soda and ate the unhealthily salty snacks, Danner suggested offhandedly, as though she didn't know it would make my whole summer, that we try to meet up and explore some old places in town. Unfortunately, we would only get to the first one she mentioned, the old graveyard in town that had been filled decades ago. Before I was drafted to work on the farm and couldn't pursue my desired pastimes, the graveyard itself hadn't been very creepy, except there had definitely been someone there with us at the time. We had met up around the second week of summer break sometime around 10:30. It was the earliest I could get away from work, but Danner didn't seem to mind. It had rained during the day, but instead of making the night cooler, it was just miserably hot and muggy. Danner was already standing outside the cemetery gate when I rolled up in a purloined farm truck. No one had asked me where I was going, and nobody particularly seemed to care. My father told me not to get killed as I drove past. My uncle made some comments about me getting some. I made an effort not to flick them off. Danner flicked her prepared flashlight at her face when I got there, as if I wouldn't have been able to tell it was her. She excitedly bounced up to my side of the truck as I opened it, and nearly pulled me out onto the ground. She clung to my arm and started telling me all the gruesome history of the interred. The original family for whom the cemetery was named after had all died within short order of each other of a mysterious disease, and there were a number of child graves within. This particular graveyard even had a lich gate, she pointed out, something very unusual for cemeteries in America. I was beginning to think this was just an excuse for her to spend time with me, which I was more than comfortable with. I had brought a mode of seclusion and was feeling pretty good about the trip as a whole, and then I saw the man standing past the fence. He was standing, kind of hunched, with his hands wrapped around the bars of the fence, staring in at us. His eyes were too wide and glittery and bright. He didn't seem to have excellent control of his mouth. He was slavering and there was drool on his chin. He couldn't have been very old, maybe in his 40s, but he was bald as an old man with only patches of hair on his skull, and he stood completely still, only moving his head to watch us. I pointed this out to Danner as soon as I noticed, asking if she knew him. Her face immediately soured, but she said she didn't. She rather boldly flashed the light from her flashlight directly in his eyes. The only reason I had seen him was because she had flicked the beam over him as she was explaining a large, nearly monumental tombstone. The guy shrieked like Gollum threatened with sting and clapped his hands over his eyes. And then he fucking hissed, like a snake. I have never heard, and never wish to hear again, a sound like that from a human being. And then he immediately started trying to climb the fence. I grabbed Danner and booked it back to the truck. We hit the gate just as I heard the thump of his impact on the ground. Danner, who was uncharacteristically just as scared as me, practically climbed through the open window, and I was right behind her. The guy had reached the gate just as I fired up the truck. His eyes looked too wide and completely black. It could have been drugs. It could have been him standing there, watching us in the dark for the hour we were there. He didn't pass the gate, though. As I tore away from the edge of the road, I could hear him hissing over the engine. We both agreed no more after dark outings. I drove her to the four-wheeler she had driven there and asked her if she would be okay. She was certain she would be, so I let her go. I should have known. As I watched her speed across a field, I had the feeling it would be the last time I would see her that summer. And it was. At that point, our scary adventures had been reduced to a minimum. We didn't see each other during the summer past that, and I started dating a girl in my class the next year. As I mentioned before, she was kind of the opposite of Danner Vane, a little materialistic and self-centered, but she was funny. She made me laugh, and I fell instantly in love, and I was basically able to forget Danner. This girl needed me on a fundamental level for emotional and mental support, and I, the nutcase that I am, felt I needed that. I knew that I could very well have been the only friend Danner had, but we were too far apart in age and distance, and I am nothing if not practical. I knew Danner would graduate before me, go to college, and the distance between us would make a relationship impossible to maintain. Danner and I would continue hanging out in school before she graduated, but we never went haunt hunting again to the degree we used to. We would talk about scary stuff and watch the occasional horror movie in the computer lab together. But my time was largely taken up by my job, my girlfriend, and other parts of my life. It wouldn't be until a few years into college that I realized Danner was going to school literally a mile away from me. I was still going out with the same girl from high school, who was a little further from me than Danner, and I still had my job at home, but being in school alleviated me of a lot of these demands. I contacted Danner on Facebook, and we immediately hit it off again, and that was where our scary experiences picked back up. Anyway, it was really wonderful to see Danner again after all that time. She was a little different from high school, a much happier, much cheerier person, but her love of the paranormal hadn't changed. I drove to her apartment on the day we had agreed to meet, and spent a lot of time going through old RP books, music, and reminiscing. She laughed out loud at the thought of our shenanigans, and then, with a sly little look, asked, "Would you want to do it again? I know some good places." What could I say other than yes? This girl made me feel more alive and complete than I had in ages, and plus the thrill of finding these scary places was alluring enough. That night, we went gallivanting across town to yet another graveyard. It was lucky we went to college so far away from our home, but the memory from our last graveyard visit chilled me. Danner just laughed at it, though. She assumed he was high on something. She grabbed my hand and pulled me through all the way to the back of the graveyard. "This is where the oldest graves are," she informed me quietly. We were both nearly whispering, though I wasn't sure why. It wasn't like we were disturbing anyone, and no cops regularly patrolled the area. She abruptly stopped about 100 yards from the back of the graveyard and pointed. "Look." I directed my gaze to the heavily wooded area and squinted against the dimming light. 3 of the graves had been recently dug up. There were no piles of dirt around, no neat and tidy tarp to suggest that someone was coming back to finish the job. 3 graves just sitting there, probably empty. I felt a sudden lightheadedness, and my vision began to get spotty. "Where are the coffins?" I asked, quietly now because I couldn't catch my breath. Danner put her lips to my ear. "For the last few weeks, bodies are going missing from the graveyards. No one knows where they've been going or who's been taking them, only that they're missing." There was a loud, abrupt crack from the mausoleum set a few hundred yards to our left. We both froze, and then Danner turned and began sprinting back towards the truck, looking behind her to make sure I was following. She dove in and peered back to where we'd come from as I leapt into the driver's seat. As I fired up the truck, I looked over too. I didn't stay very long after I saw a person emerge from the mausoleum. It wasn't just that it was a person. Their posture was too curved for them to be moving as fluidly as they did. Even if it was another person, why they were sneaking through a graveyard from a mausoleum wasn't something I wanted to know. Unfortunately, going basically anywhere with Danner turned out to be a vaguely paranormal experience. After our cemetery jaunt, Danner insisted we go hit up a little eatery she loved so much in town. When we got there, it was normal enough, a little surreal, the way things usually are in a campus town after 10 o'clock, but nothing too out of the normal. It was only after we'd placed our orders at the counter that shit started. The low hum of music over the PA hissed abruptly, and then changed to another faint station, changed again to an almost deafening rock station. Then, as Danner and I both stared at the radio, set up just next to the service area, the thing quietly switched off. The guy who had been manning the front at the time came out, muttering. He was one of those guys that you were reasonably certain was on several medications, and he'd taken the night shift to ensure the government couldn't track him. He glared especially hard at Danner, and then waddled back into the kitchen. When we got our food and went to go sit was another slightly disconcerting thing. The lights started flickering and then dimming. Danner told me it was why she loved this place, and told me to go check out the women's bathroom. I thought this was a rather odd request, and she told me to relax. It wasn't like anyone used the women's bathroom anymore anyway. I told her the only way I would go was if she went with me, so we went together. Danner walked in briskly, as though she was going to apply fresh makeup, which she never wore anyway, and made a lot of fuss at the mirror while I hung around the open door. I noticed all the stall doors were open but one. Danner flicked her head in the direction of the closed door, which appropriately had a sign on it that read, "Out of order." I went over, not entirely sure what she wanted me to do, but I peeked in by standing on the toilet of the next stall, nevertheless. There was a lot of blood smeared on the walls, and frantic handprints on the door, pooled in the toilet and on the floor, and a lot of clumps of long brown hair mixed in. I didn't know why I hadn't noticed the smell the instant I walked into the bathroom, but it rolled up from the enclosed space in a mixture of congealed blood and defecation. I almost hit my chin. I dropped from the toilet so quickly. I managed to save my cool by spending a few minutes in the stall smacking my lips to try to get the smell out of my mouth and blinking to calm down. "They still haven't cleaned it up." Danner's voice came softly behind me. "A girl had some sort of fit in the bathroom last week. She said a man had come into the bathroom and attacked her, but there was no evidence of any other patrons but her on the camera outside. People figured she must have hallucinated and gone nuts. Seeing my face probably had less blood in it than the stall beside us, Danner wisely decided to lead me back out to the dining area. My appetite had been shot, though. We went to a bar and got hammered instead. The rest of that night, I'm not sure what happened or what was real. I remember my girlfriend being angry with me afterward, but mainly because I had ditched on the concert she had wanted to go to. It was around that time that I realized I was in love with Danner, and had been since I was in high school. I didn't really want to admit it, but it was true. And my current relationship was dead and had been for a long time. It didn't take too long before I was dating Danner, which, along with the regular snuggling and couple stuff, turned out to be a lot of horror movies, and more trips to creepy places. Of course, we did other stuff as well, but I realized soon that the bad stuff had begun to permeate my life. Danner has bad nightmares, almost every night. I discovered this early on when we spent a night together in the summer, and she woke up frequently. Once, thrashing and screaming, and then once quietly. I had a very coherent conversation with her too. "Danner, what's the matter? Can't sleep. Why not? Go back to sleep, Anon. Why can't you sleep? If I fall asleep, the man in the corner will come over. I'm protecting you." Of course there was no man. Danner was sleeping, and she was having a night terror. I started getting phone calls from strange numbers with no one on the other side, or just babbling. When I told Danner, she said she thought it was normal, as she got them all the time. Unfortunately, we didn't last as a couple very long. Danner was very obviously in love with me, to the point where I could tell she wanted to spend the rest of her life with me. Me, I wasn't sure. And the toll of this was very heavy. I became very stressed out and became attached to another girl in school. Shortly after Danner discovered this, we would break up, and the strange occurrences in my life stopped. There were no more strange phone calls, no more nightmares, no more seedy places with evil histories, and no more Danner. It would be a few more years before I would hear from Danner again, but for now I'll tell you more stories from college. Danner lived in a little apartment just off campus. It was a cozy little thing, owned by two ancient music professors and rented out to college students during the school year. It was also creepy. Danner's bedroom had a queen bed, but she told me she usually slept in the bedroom across the hall, where there were two twin beds. When I asked why, she became uncomfortable. Apparently, she was usually woken to the knowledge that there was a man in the closet next to her bed, which she usually left closed. When she woke in the middle of the night, it was always open. She also had the same problem with the doorway. She kept waking up to the feeling someone was standing in the doorway watching her. The bed itself was also hard to sleep in. She kept feeling things jumping up onto the bed with her. At first, she told me, she thought they were cats, and she was used to the sensation since she had cats at home. And then she would wake up, because she had no cats at college. Several small things happened while I was there. I remember sitting in the little dining area off the kitchen, watching Danner make supper. Her sister, who also went to college during this time, had been just leaving to take out the trash, and we all heard a chirpy little "hello." I figured it had just been Danner's sister, when Danner replied, "Hello." And then after a few seconds, she turned to me and asked me if it had been me. It hadn't. It also hadn't been the sister. It was a small, slightly unsettling mystery, also combined with the fact that the property around the house seemed uneasy. I remember while staying at Danner's apartment during a snowstorm, Danner's housemate had called on the landline, wanting to know if any of us were walking around outside, because she was hearing footsteps. We told her it was probably just snow falling off the trees. But we also told her to lock her windows and doors just in case. We did as well, and Danner drew the shades, looking pale. We often worked out together as well, but it was pretty short-lived. Running the back roads with her turned out being too nerve-wracking. About a quarter mile into our first run, I could hear something pacing us in the woods beside us, and it wasn't being particularly quiet. There was a cacophony of breaking twigs and rustling underbrush. It was more like someone was driving their car in the woods beside us, if such a thing had been possible. Danner steadfastly ignored it and kept running, and when we reached the half-mile mark, she turned down a side road that would lead us back to her college and open pasture on either side. I couldn't help but look behind us as we ran. I was certain I could see something tall, gray, and bipedal bobbing between the trees, trying to get a good look at us. When we finally got back to the gym, I demanded to know why Danner would run if she knew something like that was out there. She had just shrugged and told me it had never been that bad, and nothing had ever bothered her. But from now on, she was going to take a different route. But enough about college for now. I've got a few more stories from then, but talking about it isn't that fun. I'll move on to when Danner and I started talking again. Mainly, our correspondence was on Failbook for a time. Only got back together, physically, a couple of times. I can say with certainty we started dating again a couple years ago. Danner didn't ask me to go to her creepy little haunts anymore, as she discovered I had lost interest in doing so. I think I found out the more I paid attention to these things, the more they wanted of me. So, ignoring them was the safest. So instead of going to these places with Danner, I would often unfortunately discover her in them instead. Danner isn't too rooted to reality, if you all haven't guessed it yet. She's not too sure what's real and what's not, and reality itself doesn't seem too solid around her. Something you're sure you've done is completely gone. Conversations you've had never happened. People you thought you met never existed. The Danner I started dating in 2012 was a sad, uncertain thing. She would kind of drift from place to place if she wasn't tethered down by something. Her parents operated a farm even smaller than mine, so most of her time was taken up by working if she wasn't with me. And if she wasn't at either, there was trouble. We would make time to meet. Sometimes I would come over to see her, if only for a few hours at night, only to be unable to find her. She would always resurface from one of the pastures or an unused part of the farm with bruises and cuts on her arms and legs. Her face would be pale, and she would look at me like she wasn't quite sure if I were real or not. Her farm, by the way, is great shit haunt-wise. Something is always going on. I remember chilling in the hay mow with her and hearing a strange growl coming from the loft. We both froze, not sure how a dog, because that's what it sounded like, got all the way up there, and also not wanting to be attacked. Danner, who had been clutching my arm, looked over slowly, and we both watched as some sort of sinewy black creature quickly descended one of the barn support beams. It was about the size of a large stoat and moved like one, but it somehow also managed to climb like a squirrel. I'm not terribly well versed on my local animal lore, but I knew if it was anything the way it looked, these things are as vicious, and I knew we were an instant away from ripped to shreds. I was about to book it, but Danner was grabbing my thigh painfully. "Don't move, don't speak, don't even breathe." So we sat there still as stone, as this thing undulated past us and outside, making growling, screaming noises. As soon as it was, Danner whipped into action, slamming the barn doors shut and chaining them. Once she'd done that, she climbed up to the loft, even as I was forbidding her to, and climbing up after her, and we discovered the thing's den. A lot of black fur was strewn everywhere, along with lots of feathers and bones. The bones were all laid out in neat rows, skeletons intact. No skin, no ruined flesh, nothing. My first desire was to just burn the barn to the ground, but we both figured her dad would be upset and get the wrong idea. Eventually, Danner told me to just leave it alone, and she would too. As of yet, it hadn't hurt any of the animals. Today, though, I do see some of the cows with knee injuries, and I wonder if what we saw could have anything to do with it. Hey guys, back again, and this will probably be the last one unless I go back and recount the million little unsettling stories I have that would have been impractical to include. But for now, I'll tell you how it all led up to today. The last little story would have happened around summer of 2012. Around winter 2012, Danner was much better. Psychologically and physically, she was healthier and happier. She didn't constantly start and ask me if I had seen something, or wake up screaming, or tell me disjointed stories I know couldn't have happened. Alright, well the last part isn't so true since she always does that, and probably always will. There was a bad incident in the winter of 2012 that is kind of hard for me to talk about in general. You see, Danner had just gotten pregnant. She was freaking out badly even though I was okay. I kept reassuring her that she would be fine, and we would be able to take care of the baby, if that's what she wanted. It took nearly 3 hours before she calmed down and, sitting in my lap, smiled at me and said it was what she wanted too. Then she told me something that had happened in her childhood that made me very uneasy. She and her sister and a few of her friends had all been involved in playing in the woods around Danner's property that summer. They found what had been a little village a long time before, possibly when the land had been newly settled. They said in a rotting tin strongbox, they had found a journal with instructions in surprisingly good condition. In it, the instructions detailed how the reader could live much longer than the average person, obtain supernatural powers, and learn the secrets of the world around them. All they had to do was promise their firstborn to the Piscopultuaq. The Piscopultuaq, the journal had explained, were the spirits of the land who had taught the people in the village to become the way they were. You might also ask how I knew how to spell this. I had Danner spell it. Bell. As you can guess, promising your firstborn to anything is a pretty heavy toll, but such a thing seems impossible to a bunch of 12-year-olds. Who was going to have a baby? Babies were icky. They all took the oath and did as the journal directed them to do. They prepared a special tea made of several herbs that are actually quite dangerous to ingest and drank it 3 days before the full moon in August. Then they went back to the woods and found the ritual area, a large formation of rocks that looked like they led into a burrow. Danner said they had seen the Piscopultuaq that night. They had seen them in the woods all around them that night and had done crazy things 12-year-olds shouldn't have been able to do. Of course, they were probably also tripping very badly from a tea made of plants that make you hallucinate, but no doubt it was terrifying. She said their friendship pretty much dissolved at that point. What they had seen was too frightening to do again, and they had all been sworn to secrecy. But since that night, she had always been able to see the Piscopultuaq, sitting in the dark, waiting. I reminded Danner that she and her friends had been tripping badly, and it was highly unlikely that anyone was going to steal our unborn child. Danner slowly got into the mindset of being a mother. Unfortunately, she only carried about a month before she miscarried. The doctors said it probably hadn't been anything we did, just a problem with the fetus. Sorry, this post was kinda heavy. Thinking about it really depresses me. Shortly after this, however, I got a house of my own, and Danner moved in shortly after me. Her behavior, although a little depressed, was much better. I think that life with her parents was kind of strangling her at that point. Danner is surprisingly domestic. Every day she cooks and cleans, makes little household arrangements, gardens, takes care of the lawn, etc. We don't talk about the paranormal anymore. We don't refer to the Piscopultuaq, and the thought hadn't even crossed my mind until I started typing this story. I think she's much happier than she has been in years, and the look on her face when I proposed to her proved it. For now, that's it for me and Danner. It's about time for me to head off to work. I hope you all enjoy your days and lives and always know that even though the Piscopultuaq are out there, there's someone in your life to save you from them.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.